Chapter 1. The Frozen Cargo. The Boston Ship That Shouldn't Have Sailed. On the morning of February 13th, 1806, a two-masted brig called the Favorite slipped her moorings at Charlestown Wharf in Boston Harbor and pointed her bow toward the Caribbean. In her hold sat 130 tons of frozen pond water, sawn into blocks, packed in hay and bound, of all places, for the sugar island of Martinique. Longshoremen on the dock stopped their work to watch her go. Some of them laughed out loud. A local newspaper printed a small item calling the venture a slippery speculation. In every port from Salem to Baltimore, sensible merchants agreed on one thing. The ship was carrying a cargo that would arrive as a puddle, insure nothing, sell to no one, and ruin the young man who had loaded her. The young man was 22 years old. His name was Frederick Tudor. He had never been to sea. He had no buyers waiting in the tropics, no warehouse to receive his goods, no experience in shipping perishables of any kind. What he had was an idea so absurd that his own brother had walked away from it, and a stubbornness that would soon land him in a Massachusetts debtor's cell not once, but 3 separate times. And here is what the men laughing on the wharf did not know. The story of that ship is not the story of the ice trade. Not really. That February morning is only the surface. Beneath it lies a hidden empire that would come to move 25 million tons a year, build fortunes on 3 continents, feed the meatpacking houses of Chicago, cool the hospitals of Calcutta, employ 90,000 Americans at its peak, and then vanish so completely that within a single lifetime almost no one remembered it had existed at all. To understand how a laughingstock became a global industry, and how that industry disappeared without a trace, we have to go back before the Favorite ever sailed. Back to a New England winter, a family fortune already crumbling, and a young man's ruinous obsession with something no one else could see. Frederick Tudor was not supposed to become an ice merchant. He was supposed to become a Harvard lawyer, like his father, Colonel William Tudor, a Boston aristocrat and a friend of John Adams. But Frederick refused Harvard at 13, and by his early 20s he had already tried and failed at several ventures. Then, at a family garden party sometime around 1805, his older brother William made an offhand remark about how pleasant it would be to have New England ice down in the tropics during the hot months. William forgot the joke by evening. Frederick never forgot it at all. He began keeping a private notebook he called the Ice House Diary. In it, he wrote a sentence that would eventually be printed and mocked across Boston. He who gives back at the first repulse, and without striking the second blow despairs of success, has never been, is not, and never will be a hero in war, love, or business. He needed that sentence because the failures came fast. Ice was not a new idea in the world. Tudor knew this. He had read of the Yakhal, the great stepped clay domes of ancient Persia, some of them 2,000 years old, which had trapped winter cold underground and kept desert cities in sherbet through the summer. He knew that Roman emperors had sent runners to the Apennines for snow. He knew that in his own New England, wealthy families and colonial farmers had for generations cut ice from their ponds each January and buried it in straw-lined pits behind the house to preserve butter and milk into July. What no one had done was the thing he now proposed. No one had treated frozen water as a commodity. No one had shipped it. The first voyage of the Favorite, in 1806, lost about half its cargo to melt, and almost all the rest to the fact that Martinique had no ice house to store what arrived. Tudor came home ruined in 1812 and again after. Creditors took him to the Boston jail. By his own count, he was imprisoned for debt 3 times between 1806 and 1813. He kept building. He designed double-walled ice houses, insulated with sawdust from local sawmills, a material that was practically free, and he proved that ice stored this way in Havana could last through August. He bribed and cajoled colonial officials in Cuba and the American South into granting him monopoly rights. He wrote begging letters. He borrowed against his father's name until the name would carry no more weight. By 1815 he was still poor, still mocked, and still convinced. What he needed now was not another ship. He needed a way to cut the pond itself, faster and cheaper than any man with an axe, Nathaniel Wyeth, and the horse-drawn plow. The man who solved that problem was not a financier or an inventor by trade. He was the manager of a hotel on Fresh Pond, a modest lake about 3 miles west of Boston in what is now Cambridge, Massachusetts. His name was Nathaniel Jarvis Wyeth. Tudor had hired him to oversee the harvest crews, and by 1825 Wyeth had grown tired of watching men waste entire days chipping ragged, uneven blocks out of the pond with handsaws and iron chisels. The blocks came out different sizes. They did not stack. They melted faster because their surfaces were rough, and the labor was murderous. So Wyeth designed a tool. It looked, at first glance, like a farmer's plow. Iron teeth set into a heavy wooden frame, hitched to a horse, and drawn across the frozen surface in long, straight lines. Instead of turning soil, the teeth scored grooves into the ice, deeper on each pass. A second horse followed with a crosscutter. Within hours, an entire section of pond was ruled into a grid as neat as a checkerboard. The men then broke each square free with iron bars, floated the blocks down a channel of open water to the shore, and hauled them by pulley into the icehouse. The blocks came out identical, perfectly square, ready to stack in walls 20 feet high. Wyeth patented his design in 1829, and with that patent, something quietly enormous happened. Ice stopped being a craft and became an industry. Before Wyeth, a good crew could cut perhaps a few tons a day. After Wyeth, the same crew could cut hundreds. Costs collapsed. Tudor, who had been chasing bankruptcy for 2 decades, suddenly found himself with a product he could sell cheaper than any competitor could match, in quantities the world had never seen. Fresh Pond, that little Cambridge lake, was cleared each January like a wheat field, its frozen crops stacked and waiting for spring shipping. Fresh Pond ice went to Charleston, it went to New Orleans, it went to Havana, and soon it would go somewhere no cargo of frozen water had any business going at all. Consider for a moment the arithmetic of madness. A ship leaves Boston in the depths of winter loaded with ice. She rounds the Cape of Good Hope in the tropics, crosses the equator twice, and sails 4 months and roughly 16,000 miles to reach the humid, sweltering port of Calcutta on the Bay of Bengal. By any reasonable calculation, her cargo should be gone before she leaves the Atlantic. On September 6, 1833, the American ship Tuscany dropped anchor in the Hooghly River outside Calcutta, opened her hold, and unloaded roughly 100 tons of Massachusetts pond ice. The insulation had done its work. Nearly 2/3 of the cargo had survived. The British residents of Calcutta went, by all contemporary accounts, quietly out of their minds with joy. Some of them had not touched anything genuinely cold since leaving England, in some cases decades earlier. Within weeks, a subscription had been raised, an icehouse commissioned on the Strand, and Frederick Tudor, still technically insolvent back in Boston, was granted exclusive import rights and a tax exemption by the East India Company. The Calcutta trade alone would eventually earn him and his partners over $200,000 a year at a time when a Boston workman was paid $1 a day. The empire was moving. By the 1840s, Tudor's ships and his imitators were carrying New England ice to Rio de Janeiro, to Havana, to Kingston, to Bombay, to Hong Kong. Yellow fever hospitals in Havana ordered ice by the ton for fever patients. Sugar planters in the West Indies used it to chill their punch. And in one corner of Massachusetts, a small lake was about to become the most fashionable brand name of Victorian London. Wenham Lake sat about 20 miles north of Boston, near Salem. Its water was unusually clear, and when frozen and cut into blocks, it looked, to Victorian eyes, like glass. A London merchant named Jacob Hiddenker opened a Wenham Lake Ice Company shop on the Strand in 1844 and displayed a single enormous block in the front window each morning with a newspaper laid behind it. Passers-by could read the print through the ice. The novelty electrified the city. Within 2 years, Queen Victoria's household was a subscriber. Charles Dickens wrote about the shop, and Wenham Lake Ice became so prestigious that Norwegian competitors renamed a lake near Oslo Lake Wenham in order to sell their inferior product under the borrowed name. It was perhaps the first documented case of a British luxury brand being counterfeited by Scandinavia. A pond in Massachusetts had become a status symbol at Buckingham Palace, but the true fortune was not being made in London parlors. It was being made closer to home, on a stretch of the Hudson River. where men with names now forgotten were assembling the largest ice empire the world had ever seen. The Ice Kings of the Hudson. Rockland Lake sits on a plateau roughly 150 feet above the west bank of the Hudson River, about 30 miles north of Manhattan. In 1831, a group of local farmers formed the Knickerbocker Ice Company to harvest it. Within 40 years, the Knickerbocker had become one of the largest employers in New York State, and Rockland Lake had become, without exaggeration, the refrigerator of New York City. Picture the scene each January. Snow cleared from the surface by teams of horses dragging plank scrapers. Wyeth's plows scoring the grid. 3,000 men, most of them Irish and Norwegian immigrants, working from lantern light before dawn to lantern light after dusk. Blocks weighing 300 pounds slid down inclined ramps into vast wooden ice houses built along the shore, some of them the length of 2 football fields, each holding 50,000 tons of ice packed in sawdust from the timber mills of the Adirondacks. When the harvest ended in February, the same blocks were lowered by chute onto barges, floated down a special canal to the Hudson, and towed south to the ice piers of Manhattan. By 1870, roughly a dozen ice companies lined the Hudson between Rockland and Albany. Their combined ice houses could hold nearly 2 million tons. A single company, the Knickerbocker, was capitalized at $6 million, roughly $170 million in today's money, and it had negotiated exclusive delivery contracts with hospitals, saloons, restaurants, and tenement blocks across 5 boroughs before those boroughs were formally united into modern New York City in 1898. The men who ran these companies became known simply as the Ice Kings. They rode in private rail cars, they built mansions along Riverside Drive, they lobbied Albany, and they controlled something that, in the world before the electric refrigerator, was as essential as bread and coal. Without their ice, meat spoiled by noon, beer soured, milk went bad on the doorstep before breakfast. Surgeons had no way to cool a fever. The ice trade was no longer a curiosity. It had become a nervous system, running under the skin of the modern city, and nervous systems can be squeezed. To understand how ice reshaped America, walk with me briefly into the Union Stockyards on the south side of Chicago in the summer of 1878. The smell alone is unforgettable. 40,000 cattle a day pass through these pens. Until this year, most of them have been shipped east on the hoof, in cattle cars, losing weight and dying along the tracks. But in 1878, a Cape Cod butcher named Gustavus Franklin Swift has finally solved a problem that has defeated every engineer before him. He has convinced the Michigan Car Company to build him a boxcar with ice bunkers in the roof and a slatted floor that lets cold air circulate down through hanging carcasses. He calls it a refrigerated rail car, and he fills it with ice cut from the Great Lakes. Within 10 years, Swift & Company will slaughter, dress, and ship chilled beef from Chicago to New York, Boston, and Philadelphia at a fraction of the old cost. Meat prices in the eastern cities will fall by nearly a third. The American diet will change forever, and every single one of those rail cars will run on ice. Now travel south to Cincinnati, and to a family named Moerlein, immigrants from Bavaria who by the 1870s owned one of the largest breweries in the United States. Lager beer, the German-style Cincinnati and Milwaukee had made their own, required storage at near-freezing temperatures for months of aging. Every barrel of Christian Moerlein lager, every stein of Milwaukee Schlitz, sat maturing in vast stone cellars packed with ice cut from the frozen rivers of Wisconsin and Ohio each winter. Without ice, there is no American lager. Without American lager, there is no American beer industry as we know it. The trade was drinking itself into permanence, and in New Orleans, in the yellow fever wards of Charity Hospital, doctors laid Massachusetts ice in rubberized bags along the bodies of fever patients through the humid summer of 1878, when the epidemic killed more than 4,000 people in the city in a single season. It was the only cooling medicine they had. By 1880, the United States Census counted the ice industry in hard numbers for the first time. $28 million in annual revenue, roughly $900 million in today's terms. 90,000 men employed at the peak of the season, ice houses in every American town of any size, fleets of horse-drawn wagons, each one painted with the name of its company, working set delivery routes 6 days a week. Ice was no longer merely useful. It had become infrastructure, as ordinary and as invisible as water from the tap. And where there is infrastructure, there is always someone waiting to seize it. Monopolies, rings, and the 1900 ice scandal. Charles Wyman Morse was born on the coast of Maine in 1856, the son of a modest tugboat captain. By his mid-30s, he was known in Wall Street offices as the Ice King, and by 1899 he had done something no one before him had managed. He had cornered the New York ice market. Morse's method was patient and brutal. Through a series of quiet purchases and forced mergers between 1897 and 1899, he combined the Knickerbocker Ice Company, the Consumers, the New York, and nearly every significant Hudson River operator into a single trust called the American Ice Company, capitalized at $60 million. Overnight, one man controlled roughly 90% of the ice reaching the 5 boroughs. And then, in the spring of 1900, he did the thing every monopolist eventually does. He raised his prices. On May 1st, 1900, the price of 100 pounds of ice in New York City doubled from 30 cents to 60 cents. For the wealthy and their brownstones, this was an inconvenience. For the working families of the Lower East Side, packed into tenements without ventilation in the coming summer heat, it was a catastrophe. Milk for infants went sour by afternoon, meat for the workman's dinner spoiled by supper. Newspapers began printing the death certificates of babies who had died of tainted milk, and the phrase ice trust became a curse spoken through gritted teeth. Then a journalist at the New York Journal, owned by William Randolph Hearst, noticed something. Buried in the incorporation papers of the American Ice Company were shares held by Mayor Robert Van Wyck of New York and by several senior officials of Tammany Hall, the Democratic political machine that ran the city. The mayor of New York, in other words, personally owned stock in the trust that had just doubled the price of ice on his own citizens. Hearst's papers ran the story day after day through the summer of 1900. Cartoons showed Van Wyck seated on a throne of ice, children weeping at his feet. The scandal broke the mayor. A state investigation confirmed the shareholdings. Van Wyck did not seek re-election in 1901. Tammany Hall itself was badly wounded, and the American Ice Company was forced, under public pressure, to roll its prices back to 25 cents. But the trust survived. The trade was too vast, too woven into the city, to be dismantled by a single scandal. Morse walked away with a personal fortune estimated at $20 million, and the men who cut the ice on the frozen Hudson kept walking out each January at 4 in the morning for $1.50 a day. Because there is always a cost, and so far we have only counted it in money. The temperature on Rockland Lake at 4 in the morning on January 18, 1875 was recorded at 20 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. That is the number in the daybook of the Knickerbocker Ice Company. In real terms, on the surface of the lake, in the wind that came down the Hudson Valley without obstruction, it was colder than that. It was cold enough that a man's beard froze to his coat collar, cold enough that if he fell into open water, he had perhaps 3 minutes to be pulled out before his muscles seized. The men on the ice that morning were mostly Irish and Norwegian immigrants, some of them boys of 14 and 15, working alongside their fathers. They had walked from boarding houses in the villages of Congers and Yaak an hour before dawn. Their shift, when the harvest was in full swing, ran 16 hours. Their wages, according to the Knickerbocker's payroll ledgers, ran to $1.50 a day. There was no compensation for cold, there was no compensation for injury. There was, of course, no compensation for death. Ice harvesting killed men in 3 main ways. It killed them by drowning, when a saw crew misread the thickness of a plate near a spring or a current, and the ice gave way beneath them. It killed them by crush injury, when a 300-pound block slipped its tongs on the ramp and came down on a leg or a spine. And most often of all, it killed them slowly, through pneumonia, from working wet and freezing for weeks on end in clothing that never fully dried between shifts. On the morning of February 6, 1875, a section of ice on Rockland Lake collapsed under a Norwegian crew who had failed to notice a weakness near an inflow. The Rockland County Journal reported the loss of at least 6 men, though the true number was almost certainly higher, because immigrant laborers were often not entered into the company rolls under their real names. Some of the dead had been in the United States less than a year. Their families in Bergen and Trondheim were notified by letter, if at all. We know, from the records of Manhattan hospitals and the mortality tables of the New York State Department of Health that pneumonia and tuberculosis together were the leading killers of ice workers through the 1870s and 1880s. We know from company ledgers that the average working life of an ice harvester on the Hudson was under 15 years. A man who began on the ice at 18 was, if he was lucky, retired to some quieter work by his mid-30s. If he was not lucky, he was buried in one of the small immigrant cemeteries above the lake. They were skilled men. They read the ice the way a shepherd reads a sky. They knew which plates would hold and which would betray. And when the harvest was over and the barges went south, most of them did not follow. Most of them stayed by the lake in company housing, waiting for next winter and the winter after that. The city, meanwhile, was already devouring what they had cut. And in the city, the cost took another shape entirely. The Iceman's route and the tenement child. The New York Iceman climbed stairs. That was, in the end, the thing that broke him. In the tenements of the Lower East Side and Hell's Kitchen through the 1890s and early 1900s, a residential ice delivery meant carrying a 50 or 100-pound block, gripped in iron tongs, up 4, 5, sometimes 6 flights of unlit stairs, twice a day, 6 days a week. In the commercial routes, servicing saloons and butcher shops and hotel kitchens, the blocks were heavier still. 200 pounds, 300 pounds. Balanced on a leather shoulder pad, the Iceman climbed. The medical records of the era, in particular the workmen's compensation surveys begun by the state of New York after 1910, describe a distinct occupational profile. Ice deliverymen suffered spinal compression, hernias, and chronic knee failure at rates unmatched by any other urban trade except Steve Doring. A man who started on the wagon at 18 was by his early 40s often unable to climb stairs at all. There was no pension, there was, usually, no other work, and there was in the tenements themselves a smaller and quieter cost. The children, in Jacob Riis's photographs of the Lower East Side, taken through the 1890s, we can still see them. Small figures gathered around the tail of the ice wagon in the summer heat, waiting for the Iceman to strike a block with his pick and send chips flying. Those chips were free for a child in a tenement without refrigeration. In a summer where the indoor temperature by afternoon reached 95 degrees, a chip of ice sucked in the mouth was, quite literally, the coolest moment of the day. Newspaper accounts described children being sent up to the roof of the wagon while the Iceman was inside a building to steal from the top of the load. But there was a graver cost hidden in that same delivery. The water of the Hudson, by the turn of the century, was no longer clean. Sewage from upriver towns and factory effluent from the paper mills of the Adirondacks flowed into the same stretches where the ice was cut. In 1902, the New York City Department of Health traced a typhoid outbreak in the tenements of the East 20s directly to bacteria surviving in commercial ice delivered from a Hudson River icehouse near Athens, New York. The report is preserved in the department's annual bulletin. Contaminated ice, the investigators wrote, was functionally indistinguishable from contaminated water. Families were being poisoned by the very substance meant to preserve their food. The industry that had built fortunes had also, quietly, been killing its poorest customers. And somewhere in a laboratory in Germany, a machine was already running that would soon make the whole system unnecessary. The man who ended the ice trade was not a New Yorker, not an industrialist, and did not set out to kill any industry at all. He was a Bavarian engineering professor named Karl von Linde, and in 1876, in a workshop attached to the Technical University of Munich, he built a compressor that used liquid ammonia to draw heat out of a sealed chamber. It was not the first attempt at mechanical refrigeration. The Scottish physician William Cullen had demonstrated the principle as early as 1755, but Linde's machine was the first that actually worked reliably at industrial scale, and in 1877 the Spaten Brewery of Munich installed one to chill its lager cellars year-round. For a generation, that is where mechanical refrigeration stayed. In breweries, in meatpacking plants, in the vast holds of ships. It was too big, too dangerous, and too expensive for a private home. Ammonia leaks could kill a room full of people in minutes. Sulfur dioxide and methyl chloride, the other early refrigerants, were scarcely better. Through the 1880s and 1890s, the ice trade felt no threat at all. If anything, it grew because mechanical plants themselves needed ice to start their cycles. and because natural ice was still cheaper than any machine could deliver to a tenement kitchen. Then, in 1913, a small Chicago firm called the Domestic Electric Refrigerator Company, working under the brand name DeMelray, put a self-contained electric refrigerator on the American market for home use. It was crude. It cost $900, roughly the annual wage of a schoolteacher. Fewer than 100 were sold. But the pond, in principle, had just walked into the kitchen. The pivotal year was 1918. In that year, the industrialist William C. Durant, founder of General Motors, purchased a struggling refrigerator company in Fort Wayne, Indiana called Guardian Refrigerator. He renamed it Frigidaire, bolted it onto the GM assembly line and dealer network, and began pushing electric refrigerators into American homes with the same relentless marketing General Motors used to push Buicks and Chevrolets. The price fell. A Frigidaire that cost $775 in 1922 cost less than $200 by 1932. In 1923, there were roughly 20,000 electric refrigerators in American homes. By 1930, there were roughly 1.5 million. By 1940, there were more than 15 million. The Iceman still climbed the stairs. But behind an increasing number of tenement doors, there was no longer an icebox waiting at the top. There was a humming white cabinet plugged into the wall, making its own cold out of nothing but electricity and a small closed loop of pressurized gas. The pond had been rendered obsolete in the cellar, the last harvest on Rockland Lake. The trade did not die everywhere at once. It died in layers. The first layer to go was the export trade, killed by mechanical refrigeration on ships. The second was the commercial trade, killed by industrial ammonia plants in the meatpacking cities. The third and last was the household trade, which held on longest because a Frigidaire in 1925 was still beyond the reach of most working families. But even that layer was collapsing, and the collapse had been foreshadowed years earlier by something no industrialist could control: the weather. The winter of 1906 was, across the American Northeast, one of the mildest on record. Rockland Lake never froze thick enough to harvest. The Hudson operators sent their crews home in January and imported ice from Maine at panic prices. The New York Times ran an editorial titled, "Where is the Ice?" warning that the great trade of the Hudson Valley was hostage to a climate no company could command. It was a warning about vulnerability. Very few people heard it as a warning about the future. Through the 1910s and early 1920s, the Knickerbocker Ice Company kept harvesting, but the market beneath it was hollowing out. Its commercial contracts were being picked off one by mechanical plants. Its household customers were being picked off by Frigidaire. In 1926, the Knickerbocker Ice Company closed its main Rockland Lake plant. The great ice houses along the shore stood empty. Within a decade, most of them had burned or been dismantled for lumber. Ice harvesting itself did not vanish overnight. In the smaller towns of Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont, farmers and small companies kept cutting local ponds for local customers into the 1930s and 1940s, largely because rural electrification had not yet reached them. On February 18, 1949, on Squam Lake in central New Hampshire, the last significant commercial ice harvest in New England was cut and hauled. The men on the ice that morning were mostly in their 50s and 60s. There was no younger generation coming up behind them. The tools they used were the same iron plows Nathaniel Wyeth had patented 120 years earlier. When the harvest ended, the tools were put away in a barn, and there they mostly stayed. An industry of 90,000 men, at its peak, had shrunk to a few old men on a New Hampshire lake in the space of a single working lifetime. Consider one last time what this trade was. It cut the ponds of New England. It sailed to Havana, to Rio, to Calcutta, to Hong Kong. It cooled Queen Victoria's dessert. It chilled the yellow fever wards of New Orleans. It fed Chicago's meatpacking empire and Cincinnati's lager cellars. It moved 25 million tons a year at its peak. It employed 90,000 men. It built fortunes, corrupted mayors, drowned Norwegian farm boys under lake ice, broke the spines of icemen on Manhattan stairwells, poisoned tenement children with typhoid, and, when it ended so completely that within 30 years most Americans could not have told you it had ever existed. And here is the strange thing. It is still all around you. When your grandmother calls the refrigerator the icebox, she is speaking a word coined for a wooden cabinet that held Frederick Tudor's frozen pond. When you walk down a narrow lane in Boston or Philadelphia or Savannah called Ice House Alley, you are walking the delivery route of a business that has not existed in living memory. If your family name is Isaacson or Everson or Larson and your people came to Minnesota from Norway in the 1870s, there is a fair chance one of your great-grandfathers stood on the ice of Rockland Lake with a saw in his hand. If you drink beer, if you eat beef that traveled 1,000 miles to reach your table, if you have ever cooled a fever with an ice pack, you are living inside the world this trade built. Even the humble ice cube in your glass tonight is the last surviving product of an industry that once shaped continents. Fresh Pond, the little lake in Cambridge where Nathaniel Wyeth's horses first dragged their plows, is now a public reservoir bordered by a jogging path. Rockland Lake is a state park where families picnic in summer. The Boston Harbor, where the Favorite slipped her moorings in February of 1806, is a tourist waterfront lined with restaurants. But if you stand on that Boston wharf in February, with the wind off the harbor, and you close your eyes for a moment, you can almost hear it. The creak of a two-masted brig, the laughter of dock workers on the pier, a 22-year-old man with an idea no one believes, watching his ship disappear toward the tropics with a hold full of frozen water. He was right. And the world he built is still, quietly, holding up the one you live in. If any part of this story surprised you or made you look at your own freezer a little differently tonight, I hope you will consider subscribing, because this is what we do here. We tell the stories of the forgotten trades and the lost worlds that built the everyday life you no longer notice. And before you go, leave a comment and tell me one thing. Which part of the ice trade struck you hardest? The Calcutta voyage, the boys who drowned on Rockland Lake, the mayor of New York quietly cashing dividends on doubled prices? Or was there someone in your own family, a great-grandfather, a great-aunt, who worked a trade like this one, and whose story you would like to see us tell? Because those stories are still out there, and they are still worth telling.